seems there's a fundamental question here, which is about illusions.
Right, yes.
I mean, the robot, the more personable it looks like, the more powerful an illusion it is.
Mm-hmm.
We know it's a machine then trying to pass itself off as a person.
Yes.
And that, those of us who are, as it were, 100% compos mentis, or think we are, will have no difficulty differentiating the two, and we'll see it just as a pretty machine. I think for people who require care and who require compassion and require the presence of the human being, it could be quite a dangerous and destabilizing illusion. And that brings me to avatars, because then again, an avatar is an illusion. If by you press the wrong button and you wiped out the avatar, you wouldn't be up on a homicide charge. At least I don't think you would anyway, but perhaps if you wiped out the virtual world and everybody else went down with it, perhaps you might have lose some friends, and Twitter would report your... But it seems to me that there is a worry. I mean, there's totally unquestionably benign uses of technology, and telecare, dissemination of information. But coming back, it does seem to me that there's quite a serious philosophical problem. Perhaps you've gone over it again and again, and I'm just coming in late into a debate you've been having already, but it seems to be particularly poignant in the case of older people and people who are dependent and vulnerable and needy.
In a clinical area, we, within our virtual world technology, have physiologically realistic avatars. And these avatars, unless they're treated, unless the interventions are correct, will decay physiologically in the way that would be expected. In other words, there's a data model underneath. And they're used primarily around emergency responder training and around emergency medicine training.
Is it possible to sort of program your avatar based on your biological data to show what will happen to you based on life choices, for example?
Yes, and a number of students have actually developed those things, for example, in the nutrition area. So, if you make particular food choices, they may affect the size of the avatar. There actually is some research in the States that is indicating that simply taking part in physical activity as an avatar, well, actually I shouldn't say simply taking part, also joining in as a community in discussion about eating and weight problems, can actually make you lose weight faster than if you're physically exercising.
No, definitely in the other sessions and in our previous work across the years, that whole sense of belonging actually coming into, and particularly if you are either choosing to continue to live on your own because you've chosen not to go into a care home, or you live in a remote space like a farm that you want to stay on or whatever, or if you have to live on your own, the actual sense of belonging in a community, say within a virtual world, or even a Facebook community, those kind of connected communities. In terms of well-being, it's definitely coming through from various different researchers, etc.
It is very interesting that in this virtual world one can get real effects. I mean, the fact that the connectivity through, I mean, we all know that there's a lot of health information about the more social capital you have, the more interaction you have with others, the better your health is. Solitude is very bad for you, loneliness is very bad for you. The idea that electronic connectedness is good for your health is very, very interesting. The idea that electronic connectedness can actually make you lose weight is even more interesting in a way. It's almost sort of magic thinking, isn't it? You sort of e-sweat, presumably, and so on.
I mean, with a lot of particularly neurological problems, such as Parkinson's disease, we're talking before about maybe you don't want a robot wiping your bottom. It depends what circumstances you're in. Maybe around the table here, if I say, oh, here's an implant, I'm going to put these electrodes into your brain. Hey, hold on a minute, I don't... Some of you may say yes, but some probably would say, no, I don't want that. If you have a problem such as Parkinson's disease, and particularly as some of the pharmaceutical methods, the drugs, either they're not too good or they wear off after a while, they'd be very, very happy to have technology such as that shoved directly into their brain, because it opens the possibility of overcoming their problem. I agree very strongly with Ray's point. The key for trying to minimise the area under the graph, not just extend it and have this big thing, but minimise the area. And I think one way that we can help to do that is use of artificial intelligence to either counteract what your brain is deciding to do itself with diet. The possibilities there of putting an implant in, and like I had a nice little chocolate biscuit. If I had the appropriate implant, it may well as it's a slim plant, effectively. It says no, you're not going to. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's where you heard it first. That it monitors what you're doing. It actually improves your lifestyle by, even if it's just an advisor inside your head.
So I was interested by the notion that we accept technology in some places and not in others. We accepted pacemakers right from day one, really, as a revolution that was, almost unquestionably good. Similarly with Parkinson's, soon they'll have little probes and capsules inserted so diabetic patients, their insulin levels are tested and released automatically rather than human intervention.
Cochlear implants
That's
as well.
right. So that seems okay. I'm intrigued by the gap between what is possible and what is done. And I'm wondering, drawing on expertise around the table, whether the anthropomorphic manifestation or presentation of some of these real possibilities are a hindrance or a help. Is the fact that technology looks like a robot but is clearly not, sorry, it looks like a person but clearly isn't a person, does that help or does that hinder? It might be easier if that was just a mechanical device as opposed to something that looked like a person with or without Mohican. So I'm wondering whether that sort of personal presentation helps or hinders.
What I really meant was about a personal thing, because you may well prefer a robot to do it because it's impersonal and that there isn't an invasion of your privacy. But if you look at what old people really need, it's not just the wiping of the bottom. It's about human touch. It isn't about replacing that; it's about enhancement. And I would like to say, a lot of this discussion I've heard before in other iterations of technology, and selling it as a replacement is usually a no-no.
We're surrounded by these devices anyway.
Exactly.
Whether it's washing machines or Roomba, hoovering robots or whatever. I mean, presumably that's one direction we can go. This blurring of, in quotes, the age of retirement with the use of technology. In fact, those skill sets could, as you quite rightly mentioned there, can be available in theory forever until cognitive impairment really kicks in.
I just want to make a general challenge, as it were, in relation to, it seems to me Second Life is a way of rehearsing things that you can't do safely or competently or whatever in your actual life. And I can see why that's totally appropriate for, say, resuscitation, because you can't afford to have a pyramid of corpses in order to become expert. Now I'm getting it right, 100 corpses, but now it's better to have 100 electronic corpses, which is absolutely fine. When it comes to real life, as it were, I just wonder whether there's an opportunity cost issue here. The more time you spend in Second Life, the less time you spend in First Life, the less time you spend in the utterly unscheduled, uncontrolled mess of the real world. So that was one question. And the question for Kevin was the brain.
Yeah.
It seems to be that potentially there are three people in this marriage. One is, as it were, the technology, the other is the brain, and the third is the person.
Okay.
And I mean, having spent 30 years trying new methods of neurological rehabilitation and writing a supposedly visionary paper in 1985 called Neurological Rehabilitation in the 21st Century, and having made fantastically little progress, everything from transcranial magnetic stimulation to you have made extraordinary progress, but that's largely not through, as it were, speaking to the brain in the language it understands. And I just think that in many ways the brain might be quite a significant digression or cul-de-sac.
The virtual world, it can be every bit as chaotic and serendipitous as the real world.
But when we're looking at the future and for us all going into the third age or whatever we call it, technology is going to change big time, and really in a way what we're talking of is so far is technology as it is now, and just small, trying to look out 30 years and say what sort of technologies are going to be around now for us as older people. And one of the things we come back to personal, but one of the things I'm looking at is trying to extend abilities, improve, particularly mentally, improve the range of senses that you have as input, improve the ways of communication, instead of this pathetic way that we communicate as humans with speech, mechanical pressure waves, serial signals. It's terrible when you instead of communicating in a parallel way, sending signals from brain to brain, whatever stimulation, reception. So I think there's a whole load of technology that can be useful, right? Partly as we find out a bit more about how the brain works and how to interface with it and interact with it, that is going to significantly change what it means to be human, but particularly for elderly people, and even those maybe who are presently considered as paralysed, or you can't do this, you can't do that, you're going to become enabled because the brain becomes much more critical to your functioning in the world. So for me, it's quite an exciting time being older, because in 20 years' time we're going to have so much more technology, and I would like to experience thinking to each other instead of communicating in this way, and having bits more memory, downloading bits of Wikipedia into my brain and things like that. I'd like to experience that sort of stuff for real, not just in some sci-fi things.
Just picking up from Raymond's point around, what are the dark sides of this, right? Obviously there's a lot of positive, things that can come out from the technology, but how about, isolation? People spending, I know South Korea, for example, the whole sort of video game culture there, about, spending too much time in the virtual world.
But the point is, it's not isolation.
No.
It's isolation as people would have seen it, but a child or an adult linked into Second Life or in a computer, they're not isolated.
But being medical students, towards the end of my teaching career, we spent more and more time with simulated patients. And, so you could do all the crass and terrible things on actors, which you would, instead of doing it on Mrs. Smith, who's just come in, as an emergency. And that was fine, because you then spent the vast majority of the next 3 or 4 years with real patients. So whereas the trial run in the virtual world was absolutely okay, because it was such a small part.
40 years ago in Wales, somebody took a picture of a skin lesion and walked and sent it to a consultant in a hospital, who could then say, that's dodgy, I need to see this patient, or don't worry about it.
Yeah.
I can count probably on one hand clinics in the country that adopt this technology, not just in dermatology but in other areas, and that baffles me.
Yeah.
I can see reasons why, there's vested interest in organisational change, etc. But if we're so clever about developing this technology, why aren't we clever enough? And whose responsibility is it to make sure that that is actually adopted and changes?
That's a good example. Actually, if I was going to make a diagnosis of a skin lesion, even something obvious and superficial and visual as a skin lesion, I'd want to see the patient.
Telepresence has actually been used and evidence gathered to show that you can triage people with telepresence, and there the trial actually looked at people that were triaged either in a telepresence cabinet or by a real person, and then the people that were triaged in the telepresence were also checked.
If there was a possibility for me now, here's a new piece of technology, I don't need you at all. I go somewhere, bit of information, ding, 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 jump, straight out, and it's done like that. I didn't have to hang around, I didn't have to make an appointment for about 3 days beforehand, and I still didn't get to see you because some of you weren't in or whatever.
I mean, I can think of technologies in neuroscience, which is my area of interest, which have utterly transformed everything. The onset of the MRI scan to me was one of the happiest days of my life. It transformed making a diagnosis. Never mind CT scan. So in a sense, it isn't a global opposition. It's feeling that sometimes technology is useful as a prosthesis, as a support, but not necessarily a substitute.
So at the moment I'm working on a knowledge transfer fellowship with Philips, and I'm working with a lady called Lindsay Williams, who was at Microsoft working on wearable computers herself. This is sort of 10 years ago. And she developed SenseCam, you might remember that. So she's quite well known. So obviously the project will look into Alzheimer's and how we can link scent into this project, because of obviously scent and memory. So that's quite interesting. And then, so I've been working on a whole range of different products and I'm looking to put into mobile phones, but it's really just using scent as a communication system. But long term, I'm looking to use the electronic nose, so that's really what I want to do, is be able to embed that into clothing so that you can smell stress-related body odour and then cancer and something else. So that's the long-term vision, really.
I'd just like to make a link across from what Jenny was saying to what you were saying earlier about the fullness of human communication, of which smell, of course, is a critical and essential part, and actually posit that against the sort of machinery we're actually talking about. And I link back to the work of Gregory Bateson, who's an anthropologist. He makes a very clear distinction between analogue and digital communication. And he says most of human communication, while speech is digital, the richness of human communication is actually analogue. And the areas he's looking at, for example, are in particular, by richness, I mean the ability of humans to meta-communicate. So when I'm talking here, I'm saying two things. One thing is coming out of my mouth, the other thing is my body stance, style, etc., saying this is serious. However, I could use a different stance, but a funny hat, and this would be the meta-communication channel saying this is silly. So it's in that context that one has to be able to, I'm particularly thinking of with older people, and the communication, the richness of communication that occurs in that context. Actually, how does that occur with machines?
Can we explore what Dick said just before? Because I think it's absolutely central to our concern about robots, certainly, and avatars to some extent, which is that they are sort of this layered consciousness that we're engaged in everyday life, meta, and so on. I mean, when I'm trying to communicate with you, not only am I meaning something, I hope, but you know that I'm meaning to mean it.
Yes.
And it seems to me even avatars are cognitively flat in this sort of way. I mean, okay, you
well,
may get your
well,
layers.
you're talking at the moment. I mean, if you'd have read your Metro yesterday, you would have, the media effect, you'd have read now robots are being built with biological brains. So if we're looking to the future, now we're talking, what, 20 years out?
I have to declare my
and so
interest
on.
at this stage. I've just sent to my publisher an absolute slaughterous attack on the whole, what I call neuromania, which is A, the belief we can understand the brain, and B, that we are our brains. But never mind.
So this is growing a brain. So this is growing brains within a robot body. So the avatar stroke robot that we're talking about here, that is whatever it's doing to you, but it may well have emotions because it's got brain cells just like you and I have.
Well, this is quite a fundamental question, the notion that we can build something artificially that will ultimately have the characteristics of a person. Because it's a person you want when you're ill. More than anything else. You want somebody who, even if they don't feel profound sympathy, are sympathetic enough to simulate sympathy.
I do still think that occasionally we get trapped between the is either or, and it isn't either or. So of course when you're ill you want a person to look after you, but it doesn't mean that's all you should have.
No,
so
of course.
It is an adjunct, it is an addition, and therefore it
Absolutely.
widens the potential and the ability to make changes.
I think it's been an absolutely fascinating and great discussion. It's been lively and engaging and entertaining. There's been some fantastic input.
Really good.
And I'd just like to thank you all very much for taking the time to come this afternoon.